From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I was in the classroom and all I heard was the gunshots. And then when we went outside and the police cleared us for us to go outside, I see a dead body.
It's happened again. In the 18th school shooting so far this year, 17 people have been shot dead by a heavily armed former high school student at that school in Florida. There have now been more than 200 school shootings since the Sandy Hook massacre just over 5 years ago.
This happens nowhere else other than the United States of America. This epidemic of mass slaughter, this scourge of school shooting after school shooting. It only happens here not because of coincidence, not because of bad luck, but as a consequence of our inaction.
We'll speak with the head of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence and a former Florida state legislator during the time of the Pulse shooting almost 2 years ago. She took on the Florida governor, then kept out. For people of color, banks are shutting the door to home ownership.
Here we have the likelihood of denial. So black applicants in Philadelphia are almost 3 times as likely to be denied a conventional mortgage.
Reveal found this troubling pattern in dozens of cities. Philadelphia was one of the largest.
In 61 metros across the country, applicants of color are more likely to be denied a conventional mortgage, even if they have the same financial characteristics as a non-Hispanic white applicant.
We'll look at modern-day redlining 50 years after LBJ signed the Fair Housing Act, banning racial discrimination in lending. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Parkland, Florida, 17 people were killed and 15 others wounded Wednesday in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The massacre at the Stoneman Douglas High School in Broward County, Florida, was the 18th school shooting this year. This is Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel.
We have 17 confirmed victims. 12 victims were within the building. Two victims are outside, just outside the building. One victim is on the street at the corner of Pine Island, and 2 folks, people lost their lives at the hospital.
Can you speak to the number of weapons either had and whether or not we heard that a fire alarm was pulled off? Was that in anticipation of the shooting taking place? I
don't know anything about the firearm at this point. He had countless magazines, multiple magazines, and at this point we believe he had one AR-15 rifle.
Police have identified the gunman as a 19-year-old former student named Nicholas Cruz. He was arrested a few miles away from the scene of the shooting. His classmates described him as a loner who was obsessed with guns. Police say his social media profile showed very, very disturbing content. The New York Times reports since the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre in Newtown, Connecticut in 2012, more than 400 people have been shot in over 200 school shootings. This is Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy speaking during a Senate debate after the shooting Wednesday.
This epidemic of mass slaughter, this scourge of school shooting after school shooting. It only happens here not because of coincidence, not because of bad luck, but as a consequence of our inaction. We are responsible for a level of mass atrocity that happens in this country with zero parallel anywhere else.
After headlines, we'll go to Florida for the latest on the shooting. President Trump said on Wednesday he's totally opposed to domestic violence, ending days of silence over the case of former White House Staff Secretary Rob Porter, who resigned last week after evidence surfaced he had abused his 2 ex-wives.
There you go, women. We're leaving. Thank you. We're leaving. Make your way out. domestic violence, and everybody here knows that. I am totally opposed to domestic violence of any kind. Everyone knows that, and it almost wouldn't even have to be said. So now you hear it, but you all know it.
Trump's remarks came as members of Congress said they would convene committee hearings to investigate why White House Chief of Staff General John Kelly allowed Rob Porter to hold a temporary high-level security clearance for more than a year, despite accusations of domestic violence against him and the FBI not clearing him. Speaking in an interview with Axios news outlet, Vice President Mike Pence said the administration had not handled the Rob Porter case well.
Well, this administration has no tolerance for domestic violence, nor should any American. And as I said, and as the White House has said, I think the White House could have handled this better. And I still feel that way.
Despite those remarks, Vice President Pence pushed back against growing calls in Washington for General John Kelly to resign as Trump's chief of staff.
Kelly has done a remarkable job as chief of staff for President of the United States. And I look forward to continuing to work with him for many, many months to come.
In Syria, U.S. airstrikes and artillery fire last week reportedly killed scores of Russian mercenaries who joined a failed assault on a base held by U.S. and Kurdish forces in Deir ez-Zor. Bloomberg reports more than 200 soldiers for hire fighting on behalf of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad were killed in the fighting, including many Russians. Meanwhile, some of the fiercest fighting in the 7-year conflict continues to rage in the northern city of Afrin, the rebel-held enclave of eastern Ghouta and other parts of Syria. United Nations Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, warned Wednesday civilians have been killed on a horrific scale, with more than 1,000 killed in the first week of February alone.
I've been now 4 years Special Envoy. This is as violent and worrying and dangerous a moment as any that I've seen in my time of tenure so far.
On Wednesday, videos circulated on social media showing an aid convoy arriving in the besieged rebel-held Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta. The 9 trucks were the first to arrive in the area since late November of last year. They held food and supplies for an estimated 7,000 people in an area where 400,000 civilians remained trapped by fighting. The latest violence in Syria came as the British charity Save the Children warned in a new report at least 357 million children, or 1 in 6 worldwide, are living in conflict zones. Campaigner Kitty Arey says the number is up by 75% from the early 90s. In Libya,
the sort of things they're dealing with are...
In Libya, at least 23 people were killed Wednesday after a truck carrying an estimated 300 migrants overturned and crashed near the capital, Tripoli. The crash left another 124 people injured. The crash came less than 2 weeks after 90 refugees were found drowned off the coast of Libya after their ship sank during an attempt to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. South African President Jacob Zuma resigned from office Wednesday, effective immediately after his ruling ANC party ordered him to step down or face a no-confidence vote. The 75-year-old Zuma had been in power since 2009, but faced widespread calls to step down amidst a number of corruption scandals. Longtime ANC leader Cyril Ramaphosa is poised to take Zuma's place. Ramaphosa once led the National Union of Mine Workers under apartheid in the 1980s. He later built a business empire that included mining interests, including the Marikana Platinum Mine, where police killed 34 miners during a strike in 2012. Ramaphosa is now one of Africa's wealthiest men with a net worth of about $450 million. Zimbabwean opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai died Wednesday of cancer in South Africa at the age of 65. In 2000, Tsvangirai founded the Movement for Democratic Change, which challenged longtime leader Robert Mugabe's grip on power. In response, he was repeatedly arrested by Zimbabwean authorities and subjected to beatings and torture while in jail. In 2008, Tsvangirai withdrew from a presidential election after leading in the first round of voting, after Mugabe's security forces carried out a campaign of violence against his supporters. Between 2009 and 2013, Tsvangirai served as Mugabe's prime minister in a power-sharing agreement. In Canada, an all-white jury has acquitted a white farmer for murdering a young Indigenous man from the Red Pheasant First Nation in Saskatchewan, sparking protests across Canada. In August 2016, the farmer, Gerald Stanley, fatally shot the Cree man, Colton Boushie, when he and a group of friends pulled up onto Stanley's farmland after they got a flat tire. This is a protester at a demonstration in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
If Canada and Saskatchewan are serious about reconciliation, we want more than words and tears. We want action, and we want to say in the control and destiny of our rights and for our children and for future generations.
Back in the United States, Veterans Affairs Secretary David Shulkin is set to face tough questions before a House panel today after a government report found he misused more than $120,000 in taxpayer funds to bring his wife along on an official trip to Europe that saw the pair visiting castles, taking boat rides, attending the Wimbledon tennis tournament. The scathing report by the U.S. Inspector General found Shulkin's chief of staff doctored an email to convince an ethics lawyer to approve a $4,300 ticket to fly Shulkin's wife overseas. Investigators also found another of Shulkin's aides effectively acted as a personal travel concierge, spending many hours arranging tourist activities for Shulkin and his wife rather than conducting official VA business. On Wednesday, Colorado Republican Congressmember Mike Kaufman called on Shulkin to resign, tweeting, quote, "It's exactly corruption and abuses like this that doesn't help our veterans," unquote. Shulkin has been summoned to answer questions at the House Committee on Veterans Affairs today. In Los Angeles, federal immigration agents with ICE have launched a series of raids, arresting more than 100 people since Sunday. The sweep comes just weeks after a similar series of raids in Northern California. The LAPD and many other police departments across California have said they will not cooperate with ICE on immigration enforcement, prompting ICE spokesperson Sarah Rodriguez to say in a statement the agency was targeting LA and other sanctuary cities because they were, quote, uncooperative jurisdictions. A federal appeals court has barred a predominantly white Alabama community from forming its own school district, ruling that racial animus led to efforts by Gardendale residents to secede from the majority black Jefferson County School District. This case was covered extensively by New York Times reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones, who spoke recently on Democracy Now!
So in this particular case, there was a flyer about this effort for Gardendale to secede from the Jefferson County school system, and it listed a bunch of towns, and it said, you know, we have a choice to make. Do we want to be these towns? And then it listed several other towns, or do we want to be these towns? They never mentioned race, but it was clear to everyone who lived there, the towns that the community did not want to be like were all heavily black, and the towns that the community did want to be like were all heavily white. And the white towns had seceded and broken their schools off from the larger system, and as a result, their schools and the towns were very white.
Tuesday's ruling by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals reverses a lower court ruling that would have allowed the secession to proceed. Writing on behalf of a 3-judge panel at the 11th Circuit, Judge William Pryor noted, the district court found the Gardendale board acted with a discriminatory purpose to exclude black children from the proposed school system. Despite that, Judge Pryor wrote, the district court improperly allowed the secession to continue. And in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio said Wednesday he hopes to accelerate the closure of the notorious Rikers Island jail, which he previously promised to close within 10 years. The plan would see the city build a new jail in the Bronx while expanding existing jails in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. Mayor de Blasio said it would also require a sharp reduction in the number of people New York puts behind bars.
For this plan to work, in addition to the new facilities, we have to keep driving down the jail population. I'm going to say this every time we talk about this issue. We now are at about 9,000 individuals in our jail system on any given day. That number must go down to 5,000 for this overall plan to work. Now, that's going to take a lot. We believe it can be done. And we believe when it's done, it will be crucial to breaking that cycle of incarceration.
A 2017 investigation by the Justice Department found Rikers is home to a culture of violence that regularly sees prisoners beaten by both guards and other inmates. Among the cases of injustice that have called attention to Rikers is the story of Khalif Browder, who committed suicide in 2015 at the age of 22. After he was sent to Rikers for nearly 3 years without trial when he was 16, much of it in solitary confinement, after he was accused of stealing a backpack. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Florida, where 17 people died Wednesday in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The massacre at the Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, was the 18th school shooting this year, according to Everytown for Gun Safety. This means there have been a school shooting on average every 60 hours so far this year.
Police have identified the gunman as a 19-year-old former student named Nicholas Cruz. He was carrying an AR-15 with multiple magazines of ammunition. In addition to the 17 dead, 15 people were injured. Students described the terror of being inside the school during the shooting.
I was in the classroom and all I heard was the gunshots. And then when we went outside and the police cleared us for us to go outside, I see the dead body. We locked the door, we turned off the lights, and we waited till the police said it was clear for us to leave.
Once the gunman was captured, students spoke to reporters outside the school.
We heard gunshots, we heard people knocking on the door saying they were police, but I guess they weren't. They were trying to trick us to come out. The first ones I heard, they were nonstop, 2 big shots, and then everyone just panicked. There was running everywhere.
Police have identified the gunman as a 19-year-old former student named Nicholas Cruz, who'd been expelled from the high school. Cruz was arrested a few miles away from the scene of the shooting. His classmates described him as a loner and a former member of Junior ROTC, who is obsessed with guns. Police say his social media profile showed very, very disturbing content, including many photos of his weapons arsenal. Someone using the name Nicholas Cruz also posted threatened SOTs on YouTube and other sites, including "I want to shoot people with my AR-15" and "I'm going to kill law enforcement one day. They go after the good people." Cruz's adopted father died when he was young. His adopted mother just died in November of the flu that became pneumonia. The New York Times reports since the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre in Newtown, Connecticut in 2012, more than 400 people have been killed. The shooting comes just days after President Trump released his budget, which proposes cutting millions of dollars from the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. We're joined now by 2 guests: Josh Horowitz, Executive Director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, the co-author of Guns, Democracy, and the Insurrectionist Idea. And Geraldine Thompson is a former Florida Democratic state senator. She represented the Orlando district where the 2016 Pulse nightclub massacre took place. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Geraldine Thompson, let's begin with you. You're not far from where this high school shooting took place, right near Fort Lauderdale, which, by the way, experienced another shooting where 5 people were killed just a year ago at the Fort Lauderdale airport. But now at this school, the horror of 17 people being killed, 3 outside the school, 12 inside the school, and then 2 who were injured who have since died. This must bring back horrific memories for you from Pulse in 2016, the nightclub where Omar Mateen gunned down 49 people in the club and injured more than 50 others. Yet, what has been done? What are the laws in Florida? Please share your response.
Well, unfortunately, nothing has happened since the Pulse nightclub shooting. And I said at that time, and I want to repeat today, that we have got to tighten our laws with regard to gun ownership in this country. I see no reason why a private individual needs a military-type weapon and a magazine of ammunition with enough rounds to kill hundreds of people. So we have got to tighten up who gets guns, who has access to guns in this country. And we have seen inactivity on the part of Congress. We have seen dysfunction on the part of Congress. And I think the state legislatures need to assert their power to require a constitutional convention for the purpose of amending the United States Constitution to require term limits for members of Congress. You have careerists in Congress. You have people who take ownership of the position. They don't come back to the communities that elected them. And so there is a disconnect with regard to what the people want. And I think the only way to address this is through term limits for members of Congress. And the founders anticipated that there might be a time when common people wanted to amend the Constitution and Congress refused to act. So under Article 5 of the United States Constitution, there is a provision that allows state legislatures to petition Congress for a convention, and if 34, which would be 2/3 of the states in the United States, if 34 states ask for this constitutional convention, then Congress would be compelled to call such a convention. And I think that the states need to take back the power, because to answer your question, we have seen nothing happen since the Pulse nightclub shooting here in Orlando, and that was the district that I represented. And you saw the trauma to the first responders, to the physicians, just as you see the trauma today. You have 17 people who are killed, but you have many more people who are traumatized because teachers don't sign up to go into war zones. They're not equipped to deal with the kind of weapon that was used in this massacre yesterday. And you have students who are traumatized. And we have counselors at schools, but those counselors are overburdened with paperwork with regard to standardized testing. They've got to keep a record of all of that attendance. So they don't really function in the sense that they can sit down and talk with students about what's going on with them. And I know that in many instances, there are counselors, special counselors that are brought in with regard to how to handle grief and how to handle loss. But this should not be a common occurrence in our country. And we see it happening, as you said, the number just since 2018 is just unfathomable that we should see this happening in this country because of inactivity, because of dysfunction on the part of Congress.
Well, I want to go to comments that Florida Governor Rick Scott made last night, Wednesday night, speaking at a press conference. He said the shooting was, quote, pure evil.
How could this ever happen in this country? How could this happen in this state? This is a state that is focused on keeping all of our children safe. And you come to the conclusion this is just absolutely pure evil. This state does not tolerate violence. We have law enforcement that will always show up to defend our safety.
So that's Governor Rick Scott speaking last night. He also refused to be drawn into a discussion about gun control when he was asked by a reporter if stricter legislation was needed.
You know, my heart goes out to everybody impacted today. You know, all of us can internalize this if it would happen to their family. You know, all of us want to live and have everybody live in a safe community. And there's a time to continue to have these conversations about how through law enforcement, how through mental illness funding, that we make sure people are safe, and we'll continue to do that.
So that's Governor Rick Scott. Geraldine Thompson, can you respond to what he and other legislators in Florida and politicians have said?
Well, certainly there are evil people in our society, and there are mentally disturbed people in our society. And when you combine a mental instability and you combine evil with ready access to guns, that's when it becomes lethal. So I think we need to put the focus on what we do about restricting access to guns when we know that there are elements in our society when they have a weapon go on a rampage and harm and kill other individuals. After the Pulse nightclub shooting, I asked Governor Rick Scott if we could talk about a special session, convening a special session of the Florida legislature to talk about reform. And at that time, he said that the issue was ISIS, and it was not about guns, it was about ISIS. And so my question was, what was Sandy Hook about ISIS? Was Charleston, South Carolina about ISIS? We have homegrown terrorists in the United States of America. And certainly while ISIS is a threat, we have got to also focus on what happens here in this country. And we saw in Oklahoma, the bombing of the federal building there, that was a homegrown terrorist. So we can't kind of deflect the focus away from what the real problem is, and that is that we have people who can buy guns without background checks. If the gun is bought at a gun show, if it's bought from a personal individual, then they don't have to go through the background checks, and there should be universal background checks. And the people have to take the power to require their leaders. It's about the governed rather than those who govern. And the people who are governed are saying we want responsible gun ownership in the United States of America.
Geraldine Thompson, I remember right after the Pulse shooting, there was this news conference. It was very dramatic, and the governor spoke, among others. And as they all left the podium, you got up. They left. And you got up and you said, we are going to have a very serious discussion about reform. You said about the governor and you. How do guns come into hands of violent and unstable people? How is it that assault weapons that are used in military operations get into the hands of a single individual? How is it that the magazines of weapons and bullets that are usually used in military combat come into our community? I think he'd walked off by then. But Governor Scott, who's expressing his horror yesterday, is also fighting an almost unanimous decision by a Florida court. A federal appeals court last year said doctors in Florida must be allowed to discuss guns with their patients, striking down portions of a Florida law that restricts what physicians can say to patients about firearm ownership. It was a 10-to-1 decision, the full panel of the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals finding the law known as the Privacy of Firearm Owners Act violates the First Amendment rights of doctors. The majority decision said Florida does not have carte blanche to restrict the speech of doctors and medical professionals on a certain subject without satisfying the demands of heightened security, of heightened scrutiny. Again, the court striking down Florida's law barring doctors from discussing guns with patients. Rick Scott is on the other side of that.
We called that law Glocks versus Docs. And while a doctor can ask a patient if he or she has a swimming pool to safeguard children who might be in the home, a doctor was prohibited from asking if that person had a gun. And certainly doctors have to be able to provide counseling, to provide treatment, whatever is needed in the context of what's going on in that person's life. And Governor Rick Scott wanted to require people who receive food stamps or other public assistance to take drug tests. And that was also struck down by the courts. So he's had a lot of positions that have been unconstitutional, and this is another example of that. And he is not addressing at all, as he refused to address after the Pulse nightclub shooting, what are we going to do about restricting gun ownership and making sure that there is responsible gun ownership in the state of Florida and in the United States. And now he wants to go to the Senate of the United States, and we've already seen what he's done here in Florida. And as I mentioned, there are no term limits for members of the Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives. We have term limits for the State House, for the State Senate in Florida, and the President of the United States has term limits. That individual can serve 2 4-year terms only, but there are no term limits. So you have people who take ownership of the position, and it's about self-perpetuation, it's about careerism, and the special interests fund their campaigns year after year so that as the incumbent, there's not a level playing field for an individual who would challenge them.
Geraldine Thompson, we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you very much for being with us, former Florida Democratic state senator, who was state senator during the Pulse shooting, the horrific shooting at the nightclub in June of 2016, where 49 people were killed. As we talk, not even 2 years later, about yet another horrific shooting, this one at a high school. 18 school shootings since the beginning of this year, not even 2 months ago. When we come back, Josh Horowitz joins us of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Stay with us. Hymn by Krungben here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
In Florida, 17 people died Wednesday in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The massacre at the Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, was the 18th school shooting this year, according to Everytown for Gun Safety. I want to go back to a student speaking to a reporter outside Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland on Wednesday.
All I know is that all the kids came inside the rooms and everything. There were teachers pulling us in and telling us to get in the rooms and be quiet. And so yeah, we were just okay, I guess. So.
And how are you two related?
It's my mom.
Mom, how did you feel to hug yourself?
Oh my God, you don't understand. This is so. Oh, what a joy. Oh, it's such a joy and everything. I just hope all the other kids are okay. And oh my God.
We go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Josh Horowitz, Executive Director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, co-author of Guns, Democracy, and the Insurrectionist Idea. So, Josh, you have this community in Florida. The safest city in Florida, it was just rated, the 15th safest city in the country. And yet you see what happens here happens all over the country. Can you talk about your reaction, what you're calling for now, what the coalition is calling for?
Well, I think first, no parent in America should have to go through this. And we're seeing this in towns and cities across America. There is no place that is now safe from this type of terrible tragedy. And for every parent out there, it's heartbreaking. And as a parent myself, I know the feeling you hug your kids a little tighter and you hope it's not in your school. And it's just an absolute tragedy that this happens in America. 18 school shootings this year alone. And we've seen terrible shootings in the past. I think what we need to do in America is take this seriously. Rick Scott, the governor, said, how can this happen here? It's already happened 3 times in the last 2 years in Florida. Florida has terrible gun laws. They allow people to buy, 18-year-olds to buy AR-15s, weapons of war. And for people who don't know what an AR-15 assault weapon is, it's a center-fire rifle, a powerful round that takes a detachable high-capacity magazine and has a pistol grip and a barrel shroud. And the reason you have a weapon like that is to make sure you can keep your muzzle on the target round after round. It's designed to kill people. The idea that we let these free flow in society is just wrong. The second thing that we're calling for is something called a gun violence restraining order. Now, a number of states have recently enacted this, including Connecticut, California, Washington, Oregon. And what that does is it gives family members and law enforcement the ability to remove a firearm when they feel someone is in crisis, a danger to self or others. And we've seen potentially this person may have passed, the shooter may have passed a background check because they didn't have, for instance, a felony conviction. Well, we need to make sure that when people are descending into a crisis, when they are acting violently, when they have all the indicia that they're going to be violent, they've talked about violence, they've got into fights, they've got a store of weapons, that we have the ability to call a timeout and say, whatever's going on here, let's get the weapons out of these people's hands. And so we need these types of laws. We need to make sure that we don't have assault weapons in society, and we need the ability to get these, once someone has a weapon like that, to get it out of their hands when they're acting clearly, showing signs of violence. And we need to do that now.
Well, shortly after the shooting on Wednesday, Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio tweeted, quote, "Today is that terrible day you pray never comes." He later tweeted, quote, "In days ahead will become increasingly evident that killer in today's Florida school shooting gave plenty of indications of what was to come," end quote. Numerous people on social media responded to Rubio's tweets by pointing to an October New York Times article headlined, "Thoughts and Prayers and NRA funding," which revealed Rubio has received more than $3 million from the NRA, that's the National Rifle Association of America. Speaking to Fox News Wednesday, Rubio said it was premature to talk about gun control since, quote, "people don't know how this happened." We hear first from Fox News' Pete Ducey.
Some of your colleagues in the Senate here from Washington, D.C. have already been trying to make this about policy and about gun control. Is this the appropriate time to be doing that?
It's not, only because people don't know how this happened. I mean, who this person is, what motivated them, how did they get a hold of the weapon that they used for this attack. I think it's important to know all of that before you jump to conclusions that there's some law that we could have passed that could have prevented it. And there may be, but shouldn't we at least know the facts? And so I think that you can always have that debate, but if you're going to have the debate about this particular incident, you should know the facts of that incident before you run out and prescribe some law that you claim could have prevented it. I've seen a lot of that on television, and maybe there is a law that could have prevented this instance, but we don't know that, and neither do they.
So that's Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio saying yesterday that we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And also the New York Times piece from October, just a few months ago, pointing to the fact that he's received $3 million, over $3 million from the NRA. So Josh Horowitz, can you respond to that?
Well, look, thoughts and prayers just aren't enough. If you don't, if you're not taking action, then you don't care. And I will say that Senator Rubio has had 2 years since the Pulse nightclub to do something. He hasn't. He has never, even after the incident's done, he has never, stood up and said, we need to do something to stop these killings. We need to do something to reduce acts of gun violence. And here's the bottom line, and I'm talking to the people of Florida. If you want this to stop happening, you have to have new leaders. I know people are frustrated with Congress. Congress is a frustrating place. But there's a chance to make a statement, and that is in November 2018, when we have elections across this country. And we need to make a statement. And that statement has to be, if you don't care about reducing gun violence, then we don't want you in the Congress, and we don't want you in our State House. That's got to be clear. And voters need to go to the polls ready to elect people who support gun violence prevention laws and ready to get rid of people who don't. And that's how this is going to change. Marco Rubio is not all of a sudden, I wish he would, but I don't think he will wake up tomorrow and say, we need to restrict AR-15s, or we need a gun violence restraining order in Florida, these types of laws. So if he's not going to do it, then we need new leaders.
I mean, what is amazing is that the overwhelming majority of people across the political spectrum in the United States are for more gun control. 3 of the 4 last gun control measures were passed. I wanted to go to the Senate floor yesterday, where the Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy condemned Congress's inaction in addressing gun violence.
Let me just note once again for my colleagues that this happens nowhere else other than the United States of America. This epidemic of mass slaughter, this scourge of school shooting after school shooting. It only happens here not because of coincidence, not because of bad luck, but as a consequence of our inaction. We are responsible for a level of mass atrocity that happens in this country with 0 parallel anywhere else. As a parent, it scares me to death that this body doesn't take seriously the safety of my children. And it seems like a lot of parents in South Florida are going to be asking that same question later today.
That's Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, of course, from the state where Sandy Hook happened, where so many children were gunned down in their elementary school. Donald Trump did not respond to the shooting yesterday. He did tweet out early this morning, so many signs that the Florida shooter was mentally disturbed, even expelled from school for bad and erratic behavior. Neighbors and classmates knew he was a big problem, must always report such instances to authorities again and again. A lot of people talk about American exceptionalism, Josh Horowitz. Here you have Murphy saying, we're alone in the industrialized world in having this level of mass shootings that occur. Whether we're talking about mental health or not. Your final comments.
Well, the reason is because we're the only country, industrialized country, who allows easy access to AR-15s and associated weaponry. I want to address, though, what Donald Trump said, the president said, and I think it's very disingenuous and way too easy to just say it's something about mental illness. Most people with mental illness are never going to be violent. We need to look at the actual indicia of violence and stop stigmatizing people who are mentally ill and start developing tools for law enforcement and parents and others when people are in a crisis for whatever reason and they have easy access to firearms to get the guns out of their hands. It's so easy just to sort of toss this into the mental health pile, but that is not going to stop violence. And the reason is because most people with mental illness aren't going to be violent. But there are people who are stockpiling weapons, who are acting in a dangerous way. Those are the people we need to focus on and not hide behind the trope of mental illness. We need to focus on the people who are acting dangerously.
I want to thank you, Josh Horowitz, for joining us. And to clarify, Trump tweeted yesterday, but he did not address the nation, although apparently reports are that his aides were advising him to. And I want to end with an issue that is so often connected to these mass shootings, and it's violence or harassment of women. Remember, Adam Lanza in the Sandy Hook shooting had killed his mother first. The New York Times is reporting that Mr. Cruz was obsessed with a girl at the school to the point of stalking her, a point the authorities did not raise in news briefings near the scene. We'll continue to cover the aftermath of this mass killing at the Parkland School in Florida. Josh Horowitz, Executive Director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, author of guns, democracy, and the insurrectionist idea. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, one of the biggest cases of bank redlining in decades. Stay with us.
Wish we could all pause and take a moment, discover the cause at the root of the commotion. Wanna make the world a better place? Better be ready to do whatever it takes. But is that really what you're ready to face? To see yourself in the face of the human race? But you could be disgraced just for being a believer. All I can do is make these words move through the speaker. Broadcast the world I'm categorized in. If I'm being spied on, it's not surprising. It's got me sitting back, strategizing, joining the resistance on the front lines, documenting what I see through my own eyes. Swiftly we come alive, new paradigm. I smile at all passerbys, cause words can't describe how it's time to rise. For the right price, inside job goes way beyond zeitgeist, telling us to go with the grain like white rice. And all this hype got me ghosts like white bikes, believing what we read and then we don't even think twice. Rolling loaded dice, got us skating on some thin ice. It's got me speaking up, clearing out my windpipes. I've been nice, but the time has come to rip mics. Music saves lives and I just wanna live life. Will not be defined by white stars and red stripes. When I was a little tyke, I didn't act right. Then I discovered rap and it kept me from fist fights. In the beginning I was discouraged and disliked. I was spray painting train cars at midnight, observing all the negative chatter. I just laugh cause I'm busy turning words into matter.
Words Matter by Scarlet Crow, featuring Jackson Wallen here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
A shocking new investigation by Reveal and the Center for Investigative Reporting has uncovered evidence that African Americans and Latinos are continuing to be routinely denied conventional mortgage loans at rates far higher than their white counterparts across the country. Reveal based its report on a review of 31 million mortgage records filed with the federal government in 2015 and 2016. This is Reveal data reporter Emmanuel Martinez speaking on PBS NewsHour about the investigation.
Here we have the likelihood of denial. So black applicants in Philadelphia are almost 3 times as likely to be denied a conventional mortgage.
Reveal found this troubling pattern in dozens of cities. Philadelphia was one of the largest.
In 61 metros across the country, applicants of color are more likely to be denied a conventional mortgage, even if they have the same financial characteristics as a non-Hispanic white applicant.
The Reveal investigation found the redlining occurring across the country, including in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, St. Louis, San Antonio, Texas. The report is being published as the nation is preparing to mark the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Fair Housing Act of April 1968.
The voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
We're joined now by 2 guests. Aaron Glantz, senior reporter at Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. His new investigation headline, Kept Out: How Banks Block People of Color from Home Ownership. And we're joined by Rochelle Ferrul, a 33-year-old African-American woman who was rejected twice by lenders when she tried to buy a brick row house in Philadelphia, where Reveal found African-Americans were 2.7 times as likely as whites to be denied a conventional mortgage. She was only able to buy a home when her half-white partner, Hanako Franz, signed on. At the time, Hanako was nearly unemployed and working part-time at a grocery store. Aaron and Rochelle, we welcome you both to Democracy Now! Aaron, let's begin with you in San Francisco. First of all, explain what redlining is, and then how African Americans and Latinos are kept out. Why this is such a critical story today.
Well, Amy, 80 years ago, the federal government drew lines on maps.
Well, we seem to have lost Aaron for a moment in a little satellite glitch. So why don't we go right off to Ta-Nehisi Coates. He talked about the legacy of redlining during an appearance on Democracy Now! A few years ago, the significance of what this means for the Black and the Latino community.
There's no way to understand housing as it exists today without federal policy. Black people, as was the thinking at the time, could not be responsible homeowners. The FHA literally drew up the redlining map and then basically distributed, the Homeowners Loan Corporation actually did it, and then distributed to banks who used that as policy to determine how they would lend and who they would lend to. The racism in the system was pervasive and total. And the fact that African Americans have been cut out of it is not shocking if you understand what the country was in the 1930s and the 1940s. And this redounds throughout generations. As we know, homes are how people in America build wealth largely. And if you cut Black people out of that opportunity, a lot is explained about what the African American community looks like today.
So that was Ta-Nehisi Coates. Rochelle Ferrul, tell us your story. You managed $1 million grant in your job at the University of Pennsylvania, or contractor with Rutgers Universities. 2 lenders turned you down when you tried to buy a home?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. I started my home ownership journey in 2016, soon after I moved to Philadelphia from Brooklyn, where I was born and raised. And I wanted to own property, like my mom, like many of her siblings and their parents. And from the beginning, it was just so difficult for me to make this happen. And it's not to say that I'm at all surprised. As an organizer, as someone who is very well-read and well-versed in all of the ways that Black people in America have been disenfranchised routinely over the years, I was more hurt than surprised. And it really wasn't until my partner, Hanako, who identifies as Asian, not half white, stepped in and offered to be my co-borrower that it was pretty much smooth sailing, to the extent that our application was approved, but as soon as she came on, I was largely ignored. And really all that mattered was my money. That is, unfortunately, not the experience of a large number of Black people who try to buy homes in America. Most of us are routinely denied, our applications are rejected, and we are forced to continue to rent from people who don't care about us, don't care about our well-being, and don't really consider or value the ways in which we help them accrue wealth.
And Rochelle, could you talk about how it is? I mean, you tried on 2 different occasions to get a loan. How did the loan officers treat you, and how did they treat your partner?
Sure. So in 2016, when I started this process by myself, I had all of the paperwork. I had my tax returns, which I do every year. At that time, I was freelancing and was told that I needed to have more steady income because so much of my income at the time is undocumented. To the extent that I was being paid in cash, or I wasn't being paid regularly. And they told me that I needed to have a full-time job. I then asked if it was possible for me to have a cosigner, and they said yes. I asked my mom. She said yes right away, because this has been just as much a dream for her as it has been for me. And we were rejected right away. And Angela Kaloy from FHA told us that the reason why my mom couldn't be a cosigner was because she had too much student loan debt from her PhD, from my bachelor's, and also from my brother's. My mom has been incredible in helping me stay afloat, my brother and I stay afloat over the years. And it was really hurtful. At that time, I was mostly hurt for her because she wanted to be able to support her child in this, really impactful and powerful way, and was told that she couldn't. And so I left it at that. And got a full-time job here at Penn, where I still work managing a large grant. And about a year later, I started the process again with the Penn Homeownership Services forgivable loan that's offered to Penn employees. And again, I experienced a lot of difficulty, this time with Santander Bank. It was overall I would say a humiliating process, but one that was also really beautiful in a way, because all of the people who showed up for me, including Aaron, Ray, the entire team at the Center for Investigative Reporting, Hanako, who is an incredible human, my friends, my colleagues, folks really, understood the meaning of what is happening and did as much as they could to support me in my journey. And so while this has been, and still is, months after we closed, this has been, a reckoning. Again,
So you
I'm
only
really
got
happy
it when Hanako signed on with you?
I'm sorry?
You only got it when Hanako signed on with you?
Yes, and it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's something that we still laugh about. So Hanako's co-borrower application was approved at a time when her credit score was in the 700s, and that is what mattered most. For whatever reason, what didn't matter at all was the fact that Hanako was working part-time at a grocery store. Her most recent pay stub was like $115. I was helping her pay her health insurance because, she had such little cash.
Well, listen, before we get to the end of the show, we wanted to bring Aaron Glantz in, although I think we just have you on the telephone, not in a studio, Aaron, because of the satellite glitch. But explain what redlining is and why this is such an important expose kept out, how banks block people of color from home ownership.
Well, I mean, as you said earlier, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and that was supposed to make mortgage discrimination illegal. And it was supposed to allow people to build wealth no matter what their race was. And it was supposed to end segregation. And what we found in our investigation 50 years later is that in dozens of cities across the country, people of color are still being turned away from the opportunity to live the American dream. And further, we found that the government is completely dropping the ball on its enforcement of these laws. We found that the Obama administration had sued only a handful of banks for violating the Fair Housing Act. In his first year in office, the Trump administration's Justice Department did not sue a single financial institution. And the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, which is in charge of enforcing another law called the Community Reinvestment Act, which is supposed to get banks to lend in low-income communities and underserved neighborhoods, was passing these institutions on their community lending reviews 99% of the time. So basically, the government is saying that everyone in the banking and mortgage industry is doing a fantastic job, and yet we found that across the country, people of color are being turned away even when they make the same amount of money as whites, even when they're trying to take on the same size loan as whites, and even when they're trying to buy in the same neighborhoods as whites.
And you found that Philadelphia, where Rochelle Ferrul is, it was particularly egregious.
We found that in Philadelphia, African Americans were 2.7 times more likely to be turned away for a loan, even when you take into account factors that loan officers should be using, like income. That race was still a factor even after taking into account income and the size of the loan. But as you mentioned, Philadelphia is not the only city. We found this problem in Atlanta. We found it in Washington, D.C., we found it in San Antonio, Texas, and Detroit, Michigan, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Tacoma, Washington, all over the country, 61 metropolitan areas.
We're going to have to leave it there, Aaron, but we will link to your piece kept out. And thanks so much to Rochelle Ferrul. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.